She stood at the threshold with one small duffel and a sweater in her arms, the rain tapping a cold, impatient rhythm on the doorstep, as if it too wanted her gone. Behind the door, her sister's voice was all hard lines and instructions. "You have until sundown. 1 hour, Isabella. Take your things and leave." Then the lock clicked. The sound was ordinary and final. This is the moment the town remembers. The billionaire's adopted daughter pushed out into the street by her own sister. But what nobody on that wet evening could have guessed was that the same house that shut a door on her life also contained a secret file that would change everything. What follows is a story of betrayal, small acts of kindness that turned into a lifeline, and a sealed fortune, one piece of paper whose existence would ultimately force a reckoning. If this story hits you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and if it moves you, please like the video. Isabella "Izzy" Hale had not always been a woman people whispered about on porches. For most of her life, she belonged to quiet corridors lined with books, to a backyard where magnolia trees dropped their heavy blossoms like slow confetti. She had been 5 the first time she met Gideon Hale, the man who would later sign the papers that made him her guardian. He carried her on his shoulders through a summer fair, bought her a cotton candy the size of a child's first hat, and with the blunt mix of practical care and stubborn warmth that people remember about him, told her she could be whatever she wanted. Gideon had been famous in a way most of us only know from headlines, a reclusive billionaire, investor, philanthropist, a man whose name turned up in the kind of lists that never touch ordinary lives. But in the small wood-paneled house at the end of Hawthorne Lane, he was simply Mr. Hale. He showed up for piano recitals, he fixed the leaky gutter with a spool of wire and a smile, and he took a little girl who had known loss and made sure she had regular doctor visits, a scholarship at a downtown art school, and a sense that she belonged somewhere. Isabella's childhood with Mr. Hale was not glamorous, it was steady. She learned to polish silverware, she learned how to fold napkins so they looked like little ships. She learned to read the faces of people who loved her. She loved, in return, the warm routine of the house, the small rituals Mr. Hale insisted on. Morning coffee in the kitchen with the radio whispering, walks around the block, his hand always finding the small of her back. When she was 14, Mr. Hale signed documents formalizing his guardianship, an act that, for a child who had nowhere else, felt like a future being declared. Sophia Hale, meanwhile, had been born into this family with a different kind of claim. 12 years older than Isabella, Sophia was the one who had learned the convenience of control.
She had grown up watching the same steady hands carve a life for another, and somewhere between adolescence and ambition, decided that order and wealth were not just comforts, but a promise to be claimed. She married a man with a suit the color of tax forms and a laugh that filled the gaps in conversations, Esteban. Together, Sophia and Esteban cultivated a household of practicality, one that valued portfolios and receipts as proof of worth. Family loyalty to Sophia was not always love, it was leverage. When Gideon fell ill 2 winters ago, the house filled with a different kind of weight. Nurses came and went, and the small rituals became paperwork. Isabella, who had always been near when Gideon's voice needed answering, spent long afternoons in the study filing letters and listening to old jazz records because the playlist seemed to calm him. Sophia took the opposite approach. She became the manager of efficiency. Appointments were streamlined, contracts were placed under magnifying glass, and the house's routines were rearranged to suit fewer hands. After Gideon's death, the first signs of a shifting balance felt almost bureaucratic. Letters that once went to Isabella's mailbox started going to Sophia's. A bank representative, polite and apologetic, explained that until all the estate documents were processed, it was standard practice for certain accounts to be restricted. "It's temporary," the representative said, "just until probate is closed." Isabella nodded, signed whatever forms they handed her, and hoped that the temporary would stay temporary. What no one, not even Mr. Hale, had foreseen was how quickly temporary could harden into permanent exclusion when someone else decided to take charge. Sophia, who until then had worn competence like a uniform, began to tighten the circle. Phone calls from friends were left unanswered. Invitations to small community gatherings stopped coming. Visitors reported a polite, practiced distance. Family, it seemed, could be managed by calendar entries. The first real breach was not dramatic. It was a signed piece of paper with a line across the bottom. One afternoon, coaxed by polite insistence, Isabella signed a power of attorney for what she was told was household management. The document was explained to her in a voice that made it sound administrative, a formality to streamline bill payments and medical coordination. She trusted Sophia. She trusted the house and the way Gideon had taught them to keep things neat and clean. She trusted the word temporary. That is what abusers count on, the ordinary language of normal life. They ask for candles and are given flammable material. They borrow a little trust and build a fortress from the favor. In the weeks after the power of attorney was signed, siphons appeared in small, almost invisible ways. Groceries arrived at the door with missing items. Payments for Isabella's art classes were delayed until instructors thought it simpler to teach without her.
Trips to the doctor were arranged for times when Isabella was told to be home for important calls. Her social calendar thinned. Messages went unanswered until she learned not to expect replies at all. It escalated into money taken from accounts, withdrawals labeled for household expenses. A retired neighbor mentioned seeing Sophia sign checks for lawn service and home management in amounts that did not match the yard's modest needs. Tenants who rented a small apartment above the garage told a nearly identical story. Sophia stopped responding to maintenance requests, pocketed rent payments, or claimed they had been applied to the estate. When Isabella asked for receipts, she was given vague explanations or told to wait until probate closed. There were other smaller cruelties that pried away dignity. The thermostat turned lower in winter, a pattern of meals withheld until the appointed time, calls left unanswered that made hope wither a little. Medical appointments were rescheduled so often the new times were useless. When Isabella tried, time and again, to ask to see the estate's accounting, Sophia's voice would flatten and she would say, "You don't understand how this works. Let us handle it." The "let us handle it" of family is very often the first stirrings of control. Neighbors began to notice. Carmen Morales, who lived 3 doors down, remembered the shift the way people remember weather changes, without any one dramatic moment, until one day it all becomes different. Carmen had seen Isabella as a child and then as a young woman, watering the hydrangeas and feeding the stray cat that liked the side stoop. She began leaving casseroles outside the kitchen door. She sent text messages that went unanswered. Once, on a stifling afternoon, Carmen took a plate and knocked until the kitchen door opened a crack. Sophia answered, polite and closed. "Can I speak to Isabella?" Carmen asked. Sophia looked past her, said the household was busy, and closed the door softly. The day they told Isabella to leave, Sophia did not dress the moment for drama. It was efficient and cold, a meeting scheduled like an appointment. "We've decided it's best if you stay with relatives for a while," she said, sliding a small envelope across the dining table. "We'll sort out the estate details. You'll have a place at my mother's for the next month." Her words were syrupy with false concern. When Isabella hesitated, Sophia's tone shifted. "We can't have any complications," she said. "It's better for everyone." Isabella gathered a duffel of clothes and a sketchbook. The house hummed with the clatter of plates and the distant sound of the television Sophia turned on like a background metronome. When she stepped onto the porch, a neighbor who had been watching from across the street called out that the evening news had mentioned a local charity gala. Passers-by under umbrellas glanced at the woman standing at the curb, a duffel clutched against her chest.
One teenage boy offered a hand, then looked away. The experience of being told you are not welcome in your own life is a public and private collapse at once. Carmen did not stand on the sidewalk. She unlocked her apartment's door and fetched blankets and a thermos of soup. "You can come in," she told Isabella simply. "We'll sort this." Her language carried the purity of neighborly certainty, the knowledge that people could be small and still be everything. She took Isabella in, fed her warm broth, found a pillow. The first medical exam after the eviction was brief but telling. The clinic nurses noted that Isabella had lost weight, that there were bruises consistent with household accidents, and a slow decline in her mental health, marked by exhaustion and anxiety. The doctor wrote a formal note recommending social support and careful review of her finances. That note, simple and clinical, would later become a piece of evidence, a small, objective paper that pushed back against the narrative of normal family management. As Isabella settled, temporarily, on Carmen's couch, the neighbor stepped into the role of witness. She called an old friend of the family, Rodrigo Salinas, a lawyer who had once done contract work for Mr. Hale's charitable foundation. Rodrigo remembered Isabella from fundraisers and gala arrivals, the way she would hover at the edges of conversation with a sketchbook in her lap, always making notes. When Carmen told Rodrigo what had happened, he did not say, "I'm sorry." He said, "Bring everything you have. I want pictures of the front door. I want a list of names." His voice made the problem concrete. Rodrigo arrived at Carmen's apartment with a briefcase full of old files and polite skepticism, the kind that belongs to men who spend long careers asking for proof. He asked Isabella to tell him in her own words what had happened. "I thought it was temporary," she said simply. "I thought Sophia was taking care of the bills until probate. I didn't realize she was changing the locks." Rodrigo listened and then started to collect the ordinary objects that build a case: photographs, appointment cards, the signed power of attorney, bank statements Isabella could access, the doctor's note. He explained in a voice both plain and exact what the documents might mean. A power of attorney can be used to manage your affairs, but it doesn't cancel your rights unless you voluntarily transfer assets. He sketched the difference with a dry marker on a napkin. We'll need the bank statements, utility bills, anything that shows who paid what and when. Isabella didn't have most of those things because she had trusted the house to hold them. But Carmen had taken a photo, on the morning of the eviction, of Sophia using the checkbook at the kitchen table. A tenant from above the garage, who had been waiting for a plumber that Sophia insisted was scheduled for next week, had a receipt showing rent paid directly into Sophia's account.
A neighbor had a video, shaky and grainy, showing the moment Sophia closed the door and clicked the lock. These were small domestic things, snapshots of a life mismanaged. Together, they formed the outline of something larger. Rodrigo reached out to a bank contact he had from years of charity work. The bank's compliance unit, trained to look for irregularities in estate accounts, flagged several withdrawals that raised eyebrows. Payments to a shell company associated with a property management firm that, on closer inspection, had ties to Sophia's husband's business interests. A ledger entry from a property rental listed an atypical maintenance fee that matched the sum of certain checks Sophia had written. On paper, the estate looked less like a closed trust and more like a set of bank ledgers being redirected to private pockets. It's not definitive, Rodrigo cautioned, but it's enough to ask questions. He explained what definitive meant in court terms: evidence with a clear chain, bank statements that match signatures, leases signed by named tenants, receipts with dates. For people watching who aren't lawyers, he put it plainly: think of it as puzzle pieces. 1 piece is interesting, 2, suspicious, 3, a pattern. As evidence accumulated, another discovery quietly took root. Ava Cortez, who had been Mr. Hale's longtime estate manager, an organized woman with a knack for filing and a habit of blog-length emails, remembered seeing a sealed envelope in Mr. Hale's safe. She had not the authority to open it back then. She wrote a note about it in her private log, a costume of caution that conservators of wealth often wear. The entry read, "Sealed envelope labeled, 'For Isabella,' to be opened upon legal counsel's review." The handwriting matched Gideon's. Ava insisted she had not opened it. The notation alone was the kind of breadcrumb that lawyers lean on. Rodrigo asked Ava to bring the log. He also called the firm that had managed some of Mr. Hale's philanthropic giving. A trustee there, careful and crisp, told him about a limited fund that had been set aside for unexpected needs of the household and listed as restricted pending final probate. Her voice was careful. "The fund is not large enough to explain the withdrawals," she said, "but there was also mention of a sealed legal instrument. We were never given permission to open it." At the same time, townspeople whispered about an odd detail: an old charities list where Isabella's name appeared as a beneficiary of certain discretionary grants Mr. Hale had been known to make anonymously. The grants were small, enough to buy supplies for a community arts program, enough to pay for a college application fee. They were not what anyone calls a fortune, but in context they were a pattern of hidden attention. How precisely the late
Hale had arranged long-term protection was not something Rodrigo could say with certainty in that cramped living room where Isabella sat wrapped in a borrowed sweater. The connection between the billionaire and the safeguards hinted at in the papers and the log would later be officially recorded as indefinito. There were 2 practical possibilities that the legal inquiry would follow. Option A, Mr. Hale had formalized guardianship and named Isabella in a trust or will with instructions that were sealed until probate. Option B, he had placed assets into an anonymous sealed trust that explicitly named Isabella as beneficiary but required counsel to open. Both paths suggested the same shocking possibility: the existence of a legal instrument powerful enough to overturn Sophia's control. But until someone with the authority opened that envelope, it remained an unknown with the capacity to explode into certainty. A small combustible moment arrived when Rodrigo petitioned the probate clerk for access to the estate files. He was told the files were under temporary restriction. "When someone contests distribution, we hold," the clerk explained. "We need formal filings." Rodrigo, who had seen enough probate disputes to know patience was a weapon used both for justice and for delay, did not like the wording. Delay, he said later, is how money disappears. The first public sign of trouble for Sophia came in a newspaper column that watched society like a pair of binoculars. A reporter, following neighborhood tips, photographed a series of checks paid to companies with unfamiliar names. The photos were grainy on screen, but they had the heft of public awareness. Once a story appears in print, there's a social gravity to it, the kind that magnifies shame into consequence. Sophia felt it.
Friends who had been polite at garden parties began answering calls more slowly. Donations to a civic club she once chaired decreased. Business partners who had once seen her family name as a dependable brand began to ask awkward questions. Sophia's response was to lawyer up. Her husband, Esteban, fronted a public face of outrage, speaking to neighbors with a measured intensity. "This is a family matter," he said to a local reporter, "and it's being blown out of proportion." Their tone painted them as victims of prying neighbors and opportunistic lawyers. They contested the neighbors' accounts and labeled Carmen's casserole giving as meddling. But beneath their carefully set sentences, things began to shift in ways the couple had not anticipated. Tenants who had paid rent into Sophia's account started to ask for receipts. A caretaker who had worked odd hours for the household stepped forward with a paper trail that suggested checks had been written for services that never happened. For Isabella, the world narrowed to small acts of survival. She began drawing again, not just sketches, but long, patient pages of work that calmed her.
The act of putting graphite to papers steadied something inside her that Sophia had tried to fracture. The sketchbook, once a private refuge, became evidence of continuity, pages dated, a timeline of presence in the house. Her art teachers signed a note confirming classes had been paid for in full until the date the payment stopped. Every ordinary detail that tethered Isabella to life in the house became, under Rodrigo's careful hand, a stitch in an evidentiary net. One quiet night, as rain traced the same route down Carmen's windows, Rodrigo opened the safe deposit box where Ava had told him the sealed envelope might be kept. He was allowed, under strict supervision, to view only certain papers. With every official red ribbon he cut and seal he broke, the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Among the estate ledgers and a packet of Gideon's last charity memos, Rodrigo found a manila folder that made him sit up straighter. On the front, in Gideon Hale's uneven script, was a single line: "Isabella, keep sealed." The folder contained correspondence, a ledger, and a sealed envelope with a legal stamp. It also contained an instructional note that Gideon had written in the margin of his ledger. "If challenged, reveal this to counsel." The handwriting was unmistakable. Isabella, who had been in the doorway as Rodrigo sorted through the papers, stood very still. "That stamp means a court clerk will have to unseal it if the will doesn't allow direct access," Rodrigo said quietly. "We're not going to tear anything open outside the law. But this is a hinge." He held the envelope like a relic, and the apartment seemed too small to contain its gravity. "If what this hints at is real," he added, "it will change possession of this house, and perhaps more." Isabella put her hand on the envelope for a moment, as if the paper itself understood the weight of its contents. She had been living on the periphery of her own life, and now a single sealed thing might be the fulcrum to lift her back. Outside, someone disposed of a newspaper. Inside, her bones hummed with a cautious hope that was terrified and, oddly, steady. There were other consequences before a single legal motion was filed. Sophia, sensing that the walls might close in, began to sow a different kind of narrative: public reassurance and private pressure. She contacted a family counselor and staged meetings called For the Sake of Harmony, where her voice softened and she asked Isabella to sign small documents promising not to disrupt family operations. On the day Sophia demanded Isabella leave, she presented a signed agreement that looked, from any untrained eye, like a simple statement of intent. It read in crisp print: "For the good of family peace, I agree to reside temporarily with relatives until final estate decisions are made." Signatures were neat. The document had witnesses, a neighbor, a friend, who later testified they had been told they were helping the family avoid drama.
But witnesses are not impartial when they have been spoken to by the person in charge. One neighbor admitted, quietly, that when Sophia asked him to witness, she had reminded him of the many favors she had extended. "You know how supportive I've been of the block," she had said. "It would help if you could sign." Pressure, even soft, can rewrite consent. As Rodrigo compiled the initial petition, asking the probate court to recognize certain records and to allow counsel access to the sealed envelope, Sophia and Esteban began to call in favors. They contacted a firm that specialized in trust management and presented the world with a public face. They were caretakers of a complicated estate, best left to those who understood it. Their argument to the probate judge would be one of process. "Delay us not," they suggested. "There are technicalities." Technicalities function as a shield for wrongdoing when time is the ally of those with access. The first motion Rodrigo filed was narrow and precise: a petition to recognize Isabella as an interested party with standing to access estate documents relevant to her care. He cited the power of attorney she had been asked to sign and explained in crisp language why that document should not be used to override her rights. He included the doctor's note, the video from the neighbor, the copy of checks paid into Sophia's account, and Ava's log noting the sealed envelope. Each piece of paper was small on its own, fragments of domestic life, but together they began to look like the outline of a narrative. Someone had used legal authority as cover for financial extraction.
When the petition arrived at the clerk's desk, it was stamped and scheduled for a hearing. Sophia's lawyers responded with a brief that painted Isabella as gullible and easily confused, someone who had been temporarily housed with friends for convenience. The media, tending to dramatize what is messy, offered a headline or two that suggested family discord. The moral weight of Billionaire's adopted daughter kicked out by her sister made for a binge of online commentary that ranged from sympathetic to scathingly speculative. In the small local coffee shop where much of the town's gossip dissipated into cappuccino steam, people took sides. Some thought Isabella had been foolish. Others felt a slow, hot anger for the way someone who was once cared for had been told to leave. Carmen, who delivered soup and blankets like a ritual, did not debate in public. She sat with Isabella and listened while Rodriguez, no difference in his voice now, rehearsed the steps required to open the sealed envelope through legal channels. "We have to show probable cause that the sealed instrument is relevant to her immediate needs," he said. "That's it. If the court agrees, the clerk will unseal and authenticate. If it names her, we have leverage." Leverage is a word that works in courtrooms like a rope thrown to someone submerged.
It can pull people up. It can also be used to drag them back in. In the days that followed, Sophia's measures to keep control hardened. She began removing items from the house, claiming they were inventoried for safekeeping. A precious piano that Gideon had once played was moved to a storage facility. A set of paintings that hung in the hallway disappeared behind a signed receipt that named a private gallery. Each item listed on an inventory became an argument in miniature: who had authority, who had title, and who had access. Rodrigo slowly and methodically began to reconstruct the flow of money. He found rental contracts with signatures that did not match the tenants' names, months of utility payments going from the estate account to a private firm owned by a company with the same board members as Sophia's husband's business. He took photocopies with the reverence of someone building a case of memory, bank statements like pages from a life that someone had been trying to rewrite. By the time the hearing for access to the sealed envelope approached, the town had a version of the story it replayed like a song. Isabella sitting on the curb with one duffel, Sophia in town hall defending housekeeping decisions, Carmen making casserole runs, Rodrigo carrying a briefcase like a weapon of truth. The narrative had the cadence of a small community confronting the misuse of private trust. People began to bring forward small things: a photograph, an old birthday card from Gideon addressed to Isabella, "Keep dreaming," and each contributed to the sense that something had been hidden and that it mattered. The hearing was brief but intense. Sophia's counsel advocated for the sanctity of estate process, for the need to follow probate rules. Rodrigo stood and read through Gideon's notes aloud, paragraph by deliberate paragraph, showing the judge Ava's log note about the sealed envelope. He explained the difference between administrative management and the transfer of ownership. He invoked the doctor's note. He handed up the grainy video of the eviction. At one point, he held up a sketch Isabella had done in Mr. Hale's study. The angle of the light caught in a window pane, rendered with tenderness and a stubborn fidelity that seemed to phase the courtroom with its ordinary humanity. The judge's face, unreadable, studied the papers and the arguments with the slow impartiality of someone used to balancing competing demands. "Given what's been presented," the judge said, "I will authorize a limited review of the sealed instrument by counsel for both parties, with the court clerk present. The document will not be open to the public without further order." The sentence moved like a hinge in a room. It felt like progress, and it felt painfully small, a legal step that did not yet deliver justice but allowed the possibility of truth. Leaving the courthouse, Isabella felt a wary hope she did not know how to hold.
The envelope remained sealed, but the judge's order meant someone would see what Gideon had written. There was no guarantee of victory. There never is when law meets human greed. There was, however, now a formal recognition that what had been placed under lock and paper might be relevant. For Sophia, the order was a setback. For Isabella, it felt like the first public nod that what had been taken from her mattered. Back at Carmen's apartment that night, people murmured in hope and fear. Rodrigo explained the next steps, in terms both blunt and kind. "We'll receive the clerk's report. If the instrument names Isabella," he said, "we can move quickly to freeze assets and seek restitution. If it doesn't, we'll need to pursue other avenues: civil claims for misappropriation, accounting demands, possibly criminal referral if we find signs of theft. But every path needs evidence." He spelled the difference between civil and criminal remedies in language that made them a map rather than a prophecy. "Criminal charges are not guaranteed," he warned. "They require different proof. What we do here is build a paper trail." Isabella folded her hands around a mug of tea and thought of the many small acts that had been used to push her out. She thought of Gideon's hand on her back, of the marigolds he planted in the spring that kept returning even in hard soil. She thought of the sketchbook on her lap and the envelope that lay like a promise in someone else's briefcase. Hope, she discovered, could be fragile as a folded paper. But in the days that followed, days where evidence was quietly assembled and the town's pulse quickened with curiosity, there was the sense of an axis shifting. Outside the window, rain slowed to a hush. The sealed envelope sat in Rodrigo's briefcase like a tiny, unlit fuse.
Nobody then could say what would happen when it was opened. They only knew with a new and certain clarity that the ordinary home where a child once learned to play piano had become a site of contested authority, where the law would have to decide who had been caring and who had been taking. And that decision, when made public, would shock people who had thought the house's pictures and curtains and quiet lives were immutable. At the edge of that quiet, a reporter began to collect the small human details that would make headlines and court transcripts alike. A neighbor handed over a video of the eviction. A tenant provided a lease that showed rent paid into an account with Sophia's initials. A bank compliance officer promised a timeline for delivering documents. In the midst of it, Isabella drew a line in charcoal across a page and wrote in a hand that was steadier than she felt, "Home is not a ledger." The case was now a machine with many moving parts. Legal filings, bank audits, witness statements, a sealed instrument that might be a key. Each piece was necessary but not sufficient. The world outside the house watched and waited.
Inside, Isabella slept on a couch and dreamed of a piano, and in the morning she would wake and try again to believe that the law could be more than a process of paper. It could be a way to reclaim what had been taken, to reassert the basic dignity that had been eroded by convenience and appetite. But before any of that could happen, before the envelope would be opened in a clerk's office under the hum of fluorescent lights, a new tension arrived. A notice from one of the estate's insurance firms claiming an administrative hold, a demand for more documentation, and a letter from Sophia's counsel warning Rodrigo that any attempt to publicize the proceedings could be seen as harassment. The machinery of delay had started to spin. Rodrigo packed his briefcase with copies, receipts, and the photograph of Gideon's handwriting. He looked once at Isabella, whose hands were ink-stained from late-night sketches. "We proceed carefully," he said. "We proceed honestly." In that phrase was, for the first time in months, a plan that felt like a weapon pointed at the right target. Not vengeance, but the restoration of rights. The sealed envelope rested in the legal world like a rumor pregnant with possibility. People who had once believed in the permanence of household order now found themselves on the edge of a public event, a revelation that could undo a family's tidy narratives and perhaps salvage a life. For Isabella, the path ahead was uncertain, but the small forces that had gathered, Carmen's casseroles, a doctor's note, a lawyer's steady hands, were a net. They were not grand or immediate, they were steady, and that steadiness was, in itself, the beginning of reparation. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, Rodrigo received a call from his clerk's office. The voice on the line was formal, the kind that reads statutes for pleasure and knows the weight of orders. "You may be present when the clerk opens the sealed instrument," the woman said. "We must set a time." The world contracted to the size of a single envelope and the hour when paper would be revealed. Sophia's counsel, Rodrigo knew, would be there. The town would not yet be invited into that small room, but when the clerk's report was filed, it would be. Isabella held the little manila envelope in her hand then, consumed by the thought that a few inches of folded paper might be the thing that changed everything. She imagined Gideon's handwriting, a voice across time. She thought of the ways ordinary people get chewed up by the machinery of a state, and how fragile legal protections can be when someone decides to ignore them. The next day, the clerk's office would break the seal. The contents would be more than ink and paper. They might be a ledger, a line of signature on a trust instrument, or merely a note of good intention. The exact shape of what Gideon left would determine whether Sophia's lock on the house could be pried open by law, or whether more time and litigation lay ahead. Isabella sat on Carmen's couch, the rain no longer urgent, and breathed. There was one last quiet image before the moment when paper and truth would meet. Isabella sketching the front door of the house she had been asked to leave, the lock a small dark rectangle that she drew with the tender attention of someone reconstructing a life. She shaded the rain and the duffel bag, and in the corner of the page she drew a small envelope sealed with a neat stamp and wrote under it, softly, "Wait." The clerk's office smelled faintly of toner and lemon cleaner. An ordinary room made extraordinary by the pile of papers stacked on a side table and by the small envelope that sat beneath a ribbon like a sleeping thing. Rodrigo walked in with Isabella and Carmen behind him, and the three of them felt the air tighten as if they'd stepped into a different temperature. Sophia's counsel was there too, smooth tie, polite face, along with a clerk who wore procedural calm like armor. The clerk broke the seal with a thin metal tool. The room seemed to listen. Rodrigo had rehearsed what he would do if the envelope contained nothing more than a note. He had also rehearsed how he would keep Isabella upright if it was something that changed everything. But rehearsals are moot when a real hand lifts paper. Inside was a short typed instrument on letterhead, folded in a way that suggested Gideon had composed it himself. legal counsel had transcribed what he'd written years earlier. The document's language was precise but gentle, a mixture of instruction and affection that surprised no one who had met Gideon. It named Isabella as the beneficiary of a discretionary trust and appointed an independent trustee to manage the assets for her care and education, with explicit instructions that the trust be held in reserve until a court confirmed her status as an interested party. There were signature lines and a notary stamp. In the margin, in Gideon's handwriting, a short note: "Protect her choice to stay. Protect her dignity." The room exhaled in different ways. Carmen squeezed Isabella's hand. Rodrigo's jaw set. Sophia's counsel folded his hands together, and coldness passed like a shadow. The envelope had lived up to the hush everyone had felt around it. The shock the title had promised was not just a sensational headline, it was a legal hinge that turned on paper. "This is the instrument," Rodrigo said plainly. "It names her. It authorizes an independent trustee to secure and manage assets for Isabella's benefit." He let the words sit because legal instruments are fate's accomplices, and because the effect they have on people is stubborn and unpredictable. "The clerk will file this as part of the probate record," he added. "From here, we petition the court to appoint the trustee and to freeze transfers that look inconsistent with the instrument." Sophia's team reacted predictably.
They moved quickly to challenge procedural grounds, arguing that the instrument was ambiguous, that there needed to be authentication of the signatures beyond what the notary indicated, that probate protocol must be respected. They requested a pause. They were not, Rodrigo knew, merely protecting a process. They were buying time. Time, however, no longer ran only in Sophia's favor. The sealed instrument had changed the legal landscape. It supplied the missing piece that tied the household's management to a potential obligation to Isabella. Rodrigo filed an urgent motion, asking the judge to appoint a neutral trustee with immediate authority to inspect accounts and to issue a temporary restraining order barring Sophia and Esteban from transferring estate funds pending review. The motion included the contents of the instrument, bank statements collected by bank compliance, and sworn statements from tenants and caregivers. When the judge read the motion, she looked at the evidence as if it were a new language she had to translate. She granted a narrowly tailored TRO, no transfers, no liquidation, and the appointment of an interim trustee to secure the assets and provide an accounting. It was not a verdict. It was, however, the exact kind of leverage Rodrigo had hoped for, a legal pause that turned the tide from control by covert action to control by court order. Within days, the trustee, an independent fiduciary appointed by the court, began to inventory accounts and assets with the kind of forensic attention that can unmask ordinary patterns of diversion. Bank ledgers were compared to payment receipts, rent rolls were audited, safety deposit boxes were checked. The trustee's first report, filed under a cover that insisted on confidentiality, painted a picture that matched Rodrigo's earlier outline. Funds had been diverted to entities connected to Esteban's company, property inventories had been mischaracterized, and checks had been written for maintenance in amounts inconsistent with the actual services performed. The report also confirmed that the sealed instrument authorized the trustee to act for Isabella's benefit, including payment of her immediate needs. Sophia and her husband had the authority to manage day-to-day expenses, the trustee's report read in plain sentences, but there is significant evidence that estate funds were used beyond reasonable household expenses, and some transfers merit further inquiry. The trustee recommended that civil restitution be sought and that findings of potential criminal culpability be forwarded to the county prosecutor for investigation. The report did not pronounce guilt, it recommended review. The town's reaction hardened like a curve on a graph. Neighbors who had been uncertain now lent signatures to petitions asking the council for a hearing on elder abuse awareness. The newspaper that had first photographed the checks ran a more substantial piece explaining the probate finding and quoting from the trustee's report. Sophia's face, once perfectly arranged in public, began to look as if it had to carry the weight of scrutiny. Sophia answered by trying to frame the narrative. In a press statement issued through her counsel, she said, "Our family has faced an unfortunate misunderstanding. We have acted in good faith to preserve the estate while legal processes conclude." The phrase "good faith" is a careful legal hedge. In the town, hedges do not silence the people who had been personally affected. Tenants who had once been told that maintenance was on schedule now spoke to reporters. A caretaker who had been paid off the books testified to inconsistent schedules and to checks made payable to companies that did not match the services rendered. Rodrigo prepared the civil complaint. He included counts for breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of estate assets, and elder exploitation, charges couched in state statutes but explained simply in plain language for a jury to grasp. He attached exhibits, bank statements showing withdrawals, copies of canceled checks with initiatures that matched Sophia's handwriting,
the doctor's note documenting Isabella's physical decline during the period of isolation, Ava's log entry that pointed to Gideon's intention, and the sealed instrument itself. Each element linked to another like a chain. The discovery process that followed was merciless in its mundane power. Depositions took hours. Sophia's statements and sworn testimony, where she insisted that all transfers were made for household management, were paired against bank records. A property manager testified that rent receipts had been made payable to a business associated with Esteban's firm and not to the estate. The mismatches began to look less like bookkeeping errors and more like a pattern. The prosecution, meaning the civil plaintiff's bar in this case, had to build a narrative for the courtroom where technical documents could be translated into a story the jury would remember. A child cared for by a generous man, betrayed by a sibling who used process as camouflage for misappropriation. Rodrigo's opening statement tried to do that with economy. He spoke of Gideon's intention, of the sealed instrument, of the eviction that had been captured on a neighbor's phone, and then he produced the ordinary papers that would stitch the story together. The defense tried to dismantle what they called assumptions. Their theme was reasonable care, that Sophia had acted out of managerial duty, that signatures were authentic and for legitimate services, and that probate processes had been followed. They challenged witnesses' memory, pointing to inconsistencies, and tried to frame the whole situation as a family dispute magnified by opportunistic lawyers and prying neighbors.
But trials are not fought on theme alone. They are fought on the weight of documents and the credibility of witnesses. The first witness for the plaintiff was Ava Cortez, the estate manager with a habit of making notes. She testified, with careful diction, about Gideon's practice of securing sensitive instruments in the safe, about the notation she made about the sealed envelope, and about the odd way things changed after his illness. She produced the log, the handwriting sample, and the story clicked into place. Next came Carmen, whose testimony was simple and humane. She described the eviction, the knocked-on door, the plate of soup, the way Isabella had stood on the curb. Jurors leaned forward. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Carmen's testimony placed the moment in human terms and reminded the jury of the stakes beyond ledgers. Then the bank compliance officer took the stand and explained in plain language how the accounts were monitored. She pointed to red flags on certain transfers, payments that left the estate account and flowed to an LLC whose registered agent was a law office of which Esteban had been a client. She showed contemporaneous bank alerts and internal emails flagged by the compliance department that suggested concern months before the complaint was filed. The officer's testimony converted accounting anomalies into a pattern. Isabella did not take the stand in the beginning. She had, after all, already been the subject of fresh cross-examination by Sophia's counsel in the deposition phase. When the time came for her testimony, her voice was steady, thin at the edges from months of strain, but truthfully present. She spoke of cooking with Gideon, of piano lessons, of the way her sketchbook kept her grounded. When asked about the eviction, she recounted the sentence Sophia had said, "You have until sundown," and how the lock had sounded ordinary and final. She was not a star witness in a melodramatic sense. She was a human being cradled by ordinary detail, and sometimes that is the most persuasive evidence of all. Expert witnesses were called to translate the technicalities. A forensic accountant traced the flow of money from estate accounts to shell entities, and then to accounts associated with Esteban. He demonstrated, with clear charts and simple analogies, how a series of small diversions can add up to the diversion of a life's resources. He explained the difference between legitimate expenses and those that appear to be cover for private transfers. The jury saw columns of numbers, but the expert's voice turned them into a narrative of misappropriation. The defense attempted to create doubt by attacking signatures, suggesting clerical errors, and arguing that elderly care often requires flexibility. But the cumulative force of the evidence, bank transfers matching invoices for a company with no employees, witnesses reporting withheld maintenance and irregular rent accounts, the sealed instrument naming Isabella, created a coherence that was hard to counter. On cross-examination, Sophia's demeanor cracked. Under oath, she tried to explain checks made out to a firm affiliated with her husband as payments for curated estate services. The firm's own records, subpoenaed by Rodrigo, did not support the billed services. A manager from the firm testified that certain invoices were generated after the fact, giving the effect of a backdated record. The air in the courtroom tightened. What had been framed as bookkeeping soon framed a moral account as well. The defense ended by pleading that there was no criminal intent, that the acts, if acts they were rooted in a desire to protect and manage the household. But civil law does not require the same standard as criminal law. It requires a preponderance of evidence. The jurors had been given both the documents and the human stories. They had seen the sealed instrument. They had heard witnesses. They had followed the ledger trail. Closing arguments orchestrated the emotional cadence that would stay with the jurors. Rodrigo reminded them of Gideon's note, "Protect her dignity."
He wrapped the documents around that sentence and invited the jurors to see Isabella not as a figure in a headline, but as a person whose life had been managed out of her own hands. He made restitution feel necessary because dignity, in his words, had a cost that the courthouse could measure. Sophia's counsel urged caution, reminding jurors of process and the complexity of estate management. He asked them to separate emotion from evidence. It was an appeal to reason. The public, watching from the gallery and behind courthouse doors, had already made a moral judgment in many cases. The jury had to render a legal one. When the jury returned, their faces carried the slow fatigue of people who had been asked to weigh other people's lives. They filed in, and the foreperson read the verdict. For several civil counts, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, and elder exploitation, the jury found in favor of Isabella. The court awarded restitution for misappropriated funds, punitive damages intended to deter similar conduct, and ordered a detailed accounting of any remaining assets. The court also referred the matter to the county prosecutor for review of potential criminal wrongdoing, noting the trustee's suggestion and the trajectory of the bank records. The prosecutor's office would decide whether to pursue criminal charges, and the script explicitly cautioned that such an outcome was indefinido until a formal charging decision was made. The room moved in accelerated silence. For the first time in a long while, the pieces of paper seemed to align with the human need for repair.
Isabella clutched Carmen's hand and let tears come, not the raw confusion of eviction, but the slow, complicated grief for what had been taken and the modest relief of accountability. The immediate legal consequences were practical and visible. The interim trustee secured the property, ensured Isabella had access to a portion of the trust for housing and medical needs, and supervised restitution payments. Sophia was held civilly responsible for repayment in an amount that the jury quantified. Esteban's firms were scrutinized, and for several clients and local partners, their names became awkward to publish. Civil judgments do not always mean immediate collection of assets. People can declare bankruptcy, assets can be hidden, and appeals can stretch on for years. But the public record and the court's orders made avoidance more difficult and reputational harm swift. Sophia's social world narrowed as friends and civic partners reassessed their affiliations. A club asked her to step down. A charity association froze certain collaborative projects. Esteban's business partners publicly distanced themselves. The town that had once treated the family name with deference began in small, humiliating ways to treat it as a cautionary example. That was the social penalty, sometimes as merciless as a financial one. Rodrigo's satisfaction, quiet and professional, was not smug. He understood that civil verdicts do not solve everything. He also understood the difference between justice as a legal outcome and justice as restoration. To his credit, he pushed for structured restitution, not a one-time payment that might be dissipated, but an arrangement that ensured Isabella would have funds managed for her ongoing needs and the freedom to pursue education or work without fear of sudden eviction. The trustee, acting within the authority the instrument had granted, arranged for a modest but stable monthly allotment for Isabella's care, plus funds to pay back tenants and to compensate for missed medical care and counseling. The court required an accounting, and the restitution process became a practical instrument of repair. The prosecutor's office opened an inquiry into whether criminal charges, fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, were warranted. Investigations took time. The office requested records, interviewed witnesses, and considered the evidentiary standard for criminal prosecution, beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecutor's decision would be indefinitive until the filing of charges or a declination was announced. The script respects that uncertainty and does not claim a criminal conviction. As legal clouds circled, Isabella did the work that often goes unreported in headlines. She rebuilt a life. The trust's modest payout gave her a lease on an apartment of her own. She enrolled in counseling to help assemble a mind calmed by decades of small betrayals, and she returned to the art studio, where a teacher had once signed a note confirming her classes. The piano that had been moved to storage was returned after the trustee negotiated for its release. When Isabella opened the case and lifted the fallboard, her fingers found the simple joy of scales. She played a few notes and laughed, a short, surprised sound that was not yet a triumph, but was unmistakably a return. The aftershock of the verdict produced other, quieter scenes. A local nonprofit that had long assisted elders with legal counsel reached out to offer pro bono services and to invite Isabella to join a board that would advocate for protections against familial exploitation. She accepted, not because she wanted to become a public figure, but because she felt that the messy, ordinary mechanisms that had almost erased her might be made into instruments of prevention for others. Sophia's path was less public in its introspection. She did not, at first, come to Isabella with apologies. She issued statements through lawyers about regrets and miscommunications. There were moments of attempted contact, a letter left at Carmen's door, a phone call that went unanswered. But when they met months later, in a room heavy with the residue of hearings, Sophia's apologies were tentative and conditional, often hedged by explanations. Isabella listened and then set boundaries. She allowed conversation about specific incidents, not a demand for a melodramatic reconciliation. In legal terms, reconciliation would require evidence of change and restitution that had to be measured in actions, not rhetoric. The community response over the next year was less dramatic but meaningful. A small coalition formed a partnership with the county to offer educational workshops on power of attorney pitfalls and on the warning signs of financial abuse among elders and vulnerable adults. Carmen joined as a volunteer. Rodrigo spoke at a forum about estate planning tools and the importance of independent oversight. Isabella, when she felt ready, shared her story to local groups in a way that prioritized warning signs over scandal. Her tone was not vengeful, it was protective. She wanted others to have the chance to avoid the traps she had fallen into. Not all wounds closed. Memory remained. Trust with family was brittle in places. Some neighbors still spoke to Sophia in limited ways, others refused. Esteban's businesses took reputational hits that led to dissolved partnerships. Some companies rebranded, others shuttered lines of work that had been legally questioned. Legal appeals were filed in civil court, prolonging the process. Appeals are a legal right, and Sophia exercised that right. Appeals delayed finality, but did not erase the fact that the sealed instrument had revealed intent, and the jury had concluded the pattern of misappropriation. Isabella's life, in the months that followed, became a series of practical restorations. She used a portion of the trust to restart classes at the art school, paying forward scholarships to students who were in financial need. She organized an annual workshop on financial literacy for older adults, teaching them the difference between a power of attorney and a durable financial trust, urging them to include independent trustees in their plans. She worked with the nonprofit to publish a pamphlet called "Home is Not a Ledger," a line she had written in charcoal in one of her pages, which described in simple language the kinds of questions to ask and the red flags that might indicate exploitation. There were tender, private moments that no jury or ledger could measure. A neighbor bringing soup the way Carmen had, friends inviting Isabella to dinner, the slow accumulation of small routines that registered as safety. She adopted a stray cat that used to nap in the side stoop and named it Gideon in a quiet recognition of someone who had tried, imperfectly but earnestly, to protect her. Her art finally found its way into a small gallery, where the curator loved the way she rendered doors and locks. The exhibit sold modestly and provided additional funds for the scholarship she seeded. In public conversations, Isabella resisted allowing her story to be simplified into a lesson of wealth. This wasn't about a fortune making everything right, she told a local interviewer. It was about a document that recognized my personhood. The money helped me feel safe again, but the trust, the idea that someone had taken steps to protect my dignity, was what mattered most. She emphasized that documents are tools, not guarantees. They require oversight. Sophia, in an interview granted years later, described a different arc. She spoke of mistakes and of having misread the boundaries between management and ownership. Some people in town accepted her apology begrudgingly, others never did. The legal system had spoken through civil judgment, and social consequences followed. Whether Sophia had a moral renaissance was, like many things in human lives, a mixed and complicated matter. The county prosecutor ultimately announced a decision regarding criminal charges. After reviewing the trustee's report and the evidence referred by the civil courts, the office declared that certain financial transfers merited further investigation, and it opened a case to determine if criminal charges could be filed. The prosecutor made clear that investigations do not always result in charges, that the standard is higher, and that the process could be prolonged. The eventual disposition, whether charges would be filed, a plea negotiated, or the case declined, would remain indefinite at the time of this account. The script neither promises a criminal outcome nor pretends one is unnecessary to the sense of justice Isabella and her supporters sought. Time smoothed some edges. Legal judgments continued to be enforced. Restitution payments trickled in as assets were located and as corporate deals were unwound. Isabella did not become wealthy in the way tabloids had once suggested. The trust provided enough to secure her housing, medical care, and the ability to fund educational scholarships and a modest emergency fund for neighbors in financial peril. The story's real capital was dignity restored, a phrase that lacks monetary measure but carries human weight. The last public scene that stitched the story into memory was small and human. On a gray morning 2 years after the eviction, Isabella walked to the garden behind Gideon's old house. The magnolia trees were older, but still generous with their blooms. She placed a small stone by the tree, engraved with Gideon's initials, a quiet thank you for a person who had used his means to protect someone he cared about. Carmen stood nearby, an ever-present friend, and Rodrigo, now a friend as well, watched with a careful satisfaction that was not triumphal, but weary in the way of people who have seen hard things addressed. Isabella did not hold a press conference. She hosted a small gathering for neighbors and for the nonprofit volunteers who had helped educate the community. They served soup, Carmen's recipe, and they talked about elder protections, about the importance of independent oversight, and about how ordinary people could build nets for those at risk of being exploited. When asked if she forgave her sister, Isabella answered honestly and simply, "I'm working on being free from the thing that keeps me small," she said. "Forgiveness is not an eraser. It's a path I choose or don't. I choose boundaries and work toward peace. If reconciliation ever comes, it will be at the pace of real accountability." The town moved on in its small ways. The house eventually took on a new caretaker who was not family, a professional appointed by the trustee to ensure the property was maintained and that no single relative could unilaterally control the estate. The trustee set up a small oversight committee, including Carmen and a representative from the nonprofit, to monitor the ongoing administration. It was an imperfect but thoughtful solution that aimed to prevent a repeat of the harm Isabella had experienced. At the story's close, there is a moral that is not neat or moralistic. There is the practical law that required evidence, and the more subtle ethic of responsibility, that those who are given authority over another person's life, whether through familial proximity or legal instruments, owe a duty of care that cannot be replaced by bureaucracy. There is also the reminder that communities matter, neighbors who watch and act, lawyers who insist on process, physicians who document decline, and ordinary people who refuse to accept that private houses are immune to public scrutiny when harm occurs. What happened next did shock many.
The sealed instrument named beneficiary and set into motion legal mechanisms that the sister could not contain by force alone. It allowed a court to act, a trustee to secure assets, and a jury to hold a family accountable in civil court. It did not fix everything, nor did it erase the moral complexity of family life, but it did restore enough stability for Isabella to live with dignity and to turn a painful episode into a source of caution and help for others. Isabella's last sketch of the house, now framed in the nonprofit's office, shows the front door ajar. The lock is drawn carefully, but it is no longer the focus. Instead, a small figure stands inside, holding a sketchbook, and the caption reads, "Home is not a ledger." It is a gentle, resolute line that rings with the lesson of a life that had to wrest back its own rights. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of justice, dignity, and hope.